from the window of my study. I can see the ceaseless glow of the temple of Vesta in the heart of the forum. A small flame, yet its existence is more critical to our survival than the mightiest of our legions. So long as that fire burns, they say, Rome will endure. It is the city's beating heart, a promise of eternity, a direct link to the goddess of the hearth and home. Tonight, we will not speak of the men who built Rome with the sword. We will speak of the women who protected its soul with silence and with vows. A small college of 6 women, whose lives represent one of the most complex and fascinating paradoxes in all our history. We will speak of the Vestal Virgins. In a society where a noble woman's primary role is determined from birth, to marry, bear children to continue a family line, and manage a household under the authority of a man, the Vestals were a living anomaly. They were the only women in Rome freed from the near absolute power of their fathers, the patria potestas. This is a crucial concept. Nearly everyone in Rome, male or female, lived under the authority of the head of their family until he died. But a Vestal, from the moment she was chosen, became sui juris, a legal entity in her own right. They were permitted to own property, inherit wealth, and to write a will, rights most married women did not possess. They held the most honored seats at the games and public ceremonies. When they walked in public, a lictor would walk before them, clearing a path. Even the highest consuls, the supreme magistrates of the state, were required to bow their heads and lower their fasces, the symbols of their power, to make way. If a condemned man on his way to execution happened to cross the path of a Vestal, he was immediately pardoned. They were, in many ways, the most powerful and free women in Rome. But that freedom, if one examines it closely, was purchased at an unimaginable price. It was built within a prison of ritual and a terrifying oath. The Stoic philosophy teaches us that the true prison is not one of stone walls, but of the mind's attachments, and the life of a Vestal is a profound lesson in this. It all began when they were just children. A girl was chosen to become a Vestal when she was between the ages of 6 and 10. Try to imagine that. A child still playing with her dolls, still in need of her mother's comfort, suddenly thrust into the very center of national religious life. The criteria for selection were incredibly strict. She had to be a patrician of pure, noble Roman blood. Both of her parents had to be alive, a sign of a fortunate and complete family. And most importantly, The girl herself had to be physically perfect. She could have no blemishes, no speech impediments, no hearing problems. She had to be a perfect offering for the goddess, without flaw. The selection process was called the captio, which literally means the capture, and it was exactly that. The high priest, the Pontifex Maximus, the supreme head of Roman religion, would personally choose the candidates from a list of 20 eligible girls nominated by noble families. To have a daughter chosen was a tremendous honor for the family, a sign of divine favor. But for the child, it was a permanent separation. Picture the ceremony. The little girl, dressed in a simple white gown, is brought before the Pontifex Maximus. He takes her hand, her small hand lost in his, and he recites an ancient formula, almost a spell. Amata, te capio. Beloved one, I capture you. The name Amata is an honorific, but the word capio is the same verb used to capture a prisoner in war or to seize property. In a single sentence, the child was both honored and taken captive. He would continue, declaring that she was now a priestess of Vesta, released from the power of her father, and entrusted to the goddess and the Roman state. From that moment on, she no longer belonged to her parents. She belonged to Rome. Her family might never embrace her with familial affection again. She had become something sacred and therefore distant, untouchable. She was taken to the house of the Vestals, the Atrium Vestae, a luxurious palace-like building next to the Temple of Vesta in the heart of the Roman Forum. This would be her home and her prison for the next 30 years. Her childhood hair would be cut off and hung upon a sacred lotus tree, a symbol of the renunciation of her old life. She would be dressed in the distinctive Vestal attire, a long white woolen gown and an incredibly elaborate hairstyle called the sine crines, 6 braided locks of hair woven together and coiled around her head with red ribbons. This was a hairstyle otherwise reserved only for a bride on her wedding day, a symbol of chastity and new beginnings. But for the Vestals, they would be the eternal brides of the state, married to their duty in a union that offered no love, no children, only devotion. And there, in the quiet dignity of the Atrium Vestae, amongst the 5 other women who were now her only family, her real life would begin. A life of sacrifice, of unimaginable burden, and of terrifying glory. And so the new Vestal, whom we shall call Livia, entered her new world. The atrium Vesta was not a gloomy place. It was one of the most luxurious residences in Rome, a vast villa with gardens, pools, and marble statues. She would have her own private quarters, attended to by public slaves. She would eat the finest food. In material terms, she lived a life that thousands of other women could only dream of. But it was also a gilded cage, a cloistered world with its own relentless rules. From here, Livia would begin her 30 years of service, a life precisely divided into 3 distinct decades. The first 10 years were for learning. Imagine Livia, a 7-year-old girl, sitting at the feet of an elder Vestal, a woman who has been here for 20 years, her eyes holding both deep wisdom and a distant sadness. She would not teach Livia how to read the poetry of Ovid or play the lyre, the skills of a noble matron. She would teach her the most sacred and complex knowledge of Rome, secrets that only these 6 women were permitted to know. The girl had to memorize hundreds of hymns and prayers in Old Latin, an archaic and formal language that even many educated Romans no longer fully understood. She had to learn to perform the rituals with absolute precision, not a single gesture wrong, not a single word out of place. The smallest mistake could be seen as a terrible omen, an insult to the gods that required elaborate rites of penance, sometimes lasting for days. She had to learn how to make the mola salsa, the salted flour. It sounds simple, but it was one of their most crucial duties. This was no ordinary mixture. It was made from the first ears of the harvest's emmer wheat, gathered on specific holy days. These ears were then toasted, ground by the Vestals themselves in ancient stone mills, and mixed with water drawn from a sacred spring and salt. This mixture was then sprinkled on the head of every sacrificial animal in the great state ceremonies. Without the mola salsa made by the hands of the Vestals, no sacrifice was considered valid. The stability of the relationship between Rome and its gods rested in the hands of these women. And most importantly, she had to learn the most sacred duty, the greatest burden, how to tend the eternal flame. The fire in the temple of Vesta was not an ordinary flame. It was the symbol of Rome's life, its hearth and its permanence. It could never be allowed to go out. The Vestals would take turns watching it, day and night, in shifts that lasted for hours. Imagine Livia in her first years simply sitting in silence for hours, watching how the older Vestals carefully added sacred oak logs to the flame, ensuring it never burned too high or too low. She learned to read the fire, to recognize the slightest changes in its color and shape. The stress of this duty was unimaginable. If the flame went out on a Vestal swatch, it was not merely an accident. It was a horrific sacrilege, a sign of impending disaster for Rome. It was believed that the goddess Vesta was angered, that her protection over the city had been withdrawn. The Vestal responsible faced a terrible punishment. She would be taken to a darkened room, stripped of her robes, and flogged mercilessly by the Pontifex Maximus himself, the man who was meant to be her symbolic father, until the flame was relit. It was a symbolic punishment. Her body, like Rome, had to suffer to be purified. After 10 years of learning, Livia entered her second decade, 10 years of practicing. She was now a full Vestal Virgin, one of the 6 women who held the soul of Rome. Her life was a repeating cycle of rituals, governed by the strict calendar of religious festivals. Daily, she had to fetch water from a sacred spring. She was forbidden from using the modern aqueducts, as the water for the rituals had to be living and pure, drawn directly from the source. She had to carry it back to the temple in special vessels, careful not to spill a single drop. She had to take part in the preparation for festivals and care for the sacred objects stored within the temple, objects that no one else was ever permitted to see. These objects, the pignora imperia, or pledges of the empire, were believed to be directly tied to the safety of Rome. Among them was the Palladium, a wooden statue of the goddess Pallas Athena, said to have been rescued from Troy by Aeneas. It was believed that as long as the Palladium remained in the temple of Vesta, Rome could never be conquered. Only the Vestals knew where it was hidden, and only they were allowed to touch it. They were the guardians of the state's deepest and most vital secrets. And the final 10 years were for teaching. Livia, now a mature woman, perhaps having risen to the rank of Vestalis Maxima or senior Vestal, would pass on all her knowledge and experience to a new generation of 6-year-old girls who had been captured just as she had been 30 decades earlier. The cycle would continue. Throughout these 30 years, she had to uphold one single overwhelming vow, the foundation of all her privileges and all her burdens, the vow of chastity. Her virginity was believed to be mystically linked to the safety of Rome. She was the personification of the state's purity. The city's great walls could protect its body, but the chastity of the Vestals protected its soul.
Throughout her 30 years of service, the foundation of all of Livia's privileges and all her burdens was a single overwhelming vow, the vow of chastity. It was not merely a rule, it was the very center of her existence, the source of her power, her reverence, and also her greatest fear. To understand its importance, we must understand how a Roman viewed female purity. For them, a woman's chastity was not just a personal matter, it was a component of the social order. The purity of a wife ensured the legitimacy of the bloodline, guaranteeing that property and family name were passed to the correct heir. But for a Vestal Virgin, her purity held a far greater significance. It was believed to be mystically, directly linked to the safety of Rome itself. She was the personification of the state's purity. Just as the sacred flame could never be allowed to die, her chastity could never be extinguished. It was believed that as long as the Vestals maintained their vow, the goddess Vesta would continue to protect the city. The great walls of Rome could protect its body, but the chastity of the Vestals protected its soul. This vow gave her a special and paradoxical status. In a world of men, she belonged to no single man, not her father, not a husband. And precisely because she belonged to no one, she belonged to everyone, to the state. Her celibacy was a necessary sacrifice for the good of the commonwealth. But the price of this status was an unimaginable psychological burden. Imagine Livia, now in her 20s, standing on a balcony in the Atrium Vestae, looking down upon the Roman Forum. She would see her childhood friends, now noble matrons, walking with their husbands and their children. She would see the life that she had been denied. She would never know the love of a husband, the joy of a child. Her life was a solitary path destined for service. The Stoic philosophy teaches us to accept what we cannot change, to find peace in the performance of our duty. Perhaps Livia, over the years, learned to find fulfillment in her role. She had power. She had respect. She had a family of sisters who shared her fate. But could those things ever truly fill the void of an ordinary life? That is a question only she could answer. And this vow was protected by a constant, hovering threat. The risk came not just from any personal desires that might arise. In a city as rife with political intrigue as Rome, a Vestal's chastity could become a weapon. Imagine an ambitious senator who wants to destroy a political rival. One of the most effective methods would be to start a rumor that his rival was having an affair with a Vestal Virgin. That accusation, whether true or false, was a bombshell. It attacked not just the man's honor, but the security of the entire state. Public opinion would be inflamed. The gods had been offended. An investigation would be demanded. A Vestal accused of breaking her vow would be brought before a special tribunal, judged by the College of Priests themselves. The evidence was often vague, based on rumors, on testimony extracted from slaves under torture, or on omens interpreted as signs from the gods. If she was found guilty, her fate was sealed, and it was a fate far more terrifying than death on the battlefield.
The vow of chastity, therefore, was not just a personal bond. It was a matter of national security. And our history, sadly, has recorded instances where that vow was broken, or at least alleged to have been broken. These stories show us the terrible collision between human desire and sacred duty. The power and freedom of the Vestals also placed them in a position of unique temptation. Unlike other women who were closely supervised by their families, the Vestals could move about the city freely, attend banquets, and be present at public events. They were educated, high status, and therefore intensely attractive figures. They were the celebrities of Roman society, and it was inevitable, I suppose, that some men would be drawn to this forbidden fruit. The historian Livy recounts the story of two Vestal Virgins who were condemned in the early days of the Republic. They were accused of having multiple lovers. One of the lovers, a scribe, was tortured and confessed to everything. The scandal shook Rome to its core. Or there is the more tragic story of the three Vestals condemned under the reign of the Emperor Domitian, a man known for his cruelty and his fanatical piety. One of them, Cornelia, who held the high office of the Stolus Maxima, was accused of having an affair with a man of the equestrian class. Many at the time believed the accusation was purely political, a way for Domitian to spread fear and consolidate his own power. Cornelia protested her innocence to the very end, but to no avail. These stories pose a philosophical question. What happens when a human being is forced to live a life that goes against their nature? The Stoic philosophy teaches us to use reason to control our desires. But is it realistic to demand that a young woman,
taken from her family as a child, must extinguish every human emotion, every natural longing for 30 years? Perhaps some of them did truly fail. They fell in love. They sought a human connection in a life of profound loneliness. It would be an understandable human act, but an unforgivable crime in the eyes of the state. But there were other, more tragic cases where they were the victims of malicious accusations. As I have said, accusing a Vestal was an incredibly potent political weapon, one only needed to plant a seed of doubt, a whisper of a rumor, to destroy an enemy's reputation. In a trial where evidence was often based on omens and tortured confessions, the truth becomes fragile. Imagine our Livia. She has served perfectly for 20 years, but one day she unintentionally becomes entangled in a political plot. Her name is linked to that of a powerful senator. The rumor begins to spread. At first, it is just whispers in the forum. Gradually, it becomes a roar. People start pointing at her in the street. They begin to see bad omens everywhere. A cow gives birth to a two-headed calf. A temple is struck by lightning. The mob, in its fear and superstition, begins to believe that Livia's impurity is bringing down the wrath of the gods. The pressure on the Pontiff Maximus becomes immense. He must act, must find a scapegoat to appease the crowd and the heavens. And Livia, whether innocent or guilty, has now become the perfect sacrifice.
And when a Vestal Virgin was found guilty, whether in truth or by accusation, Rome would not hesitate to enact one of the most brutal and chilling punishments in its entire legal code. This punishment was not merely intended to kill a person. It was a public purification rite, a horrifying piece of theater staged to wash the stain of sacrilege from the city. The man accused of being the Vestal's lover would face a public and agonizing death. He would be stripped naked, his neck locked into a wooden yoke, and paraded through the forum. Then he would be tied to a stake in the Comitium and flogged to death by the Pontex Maximus himself in full view of the crowd. But the fate of the Vestal Virgin was different. Her blood was sacred and could not be spilled. Her body, having been consecrated to the goddess, was inviolable. So the Romans, with their cruel and legalistic logic, devised a way to kill her without killing her, to punish her without shedding her blood. Imagine the day of the execution. Livia, if she were condemned, would be stripped of her headdress and her ornaments. She would be dressed in funeral garb, as if she were already a corpse, civilly dead. She would then be placed in a closed litter, a covered carriage normally used for the sick, and bound within it so that her movements would not profane the streets. The litter was carried through the city streets in a dreadful, silent procession. Silence, that was the most terrifying part. The city, normally a cacophony of noise, would fall utterly quiet. The people would line the streets, not cheering, not jeering, but watching with a silent horror. They did not see this as entertainment. They saw it as a painful, necessary cleansing, an event they were both compelled to watch and desperate to look away from. The procession would stop at a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of Wickedness, just outside the city walls. There, a small underground chamber had been prepared. Inside, a simple cot had been placed, along with a single oil lamp, a little bread, and a pitcher of water. Why? It was a sophisticated legal fiction. By providing these meager supplies, the Roman state was not directly starving her to death. They were simply abandoning her. Her ultimate fate was left between her and the gods. They had given her a chance, however slim, to survive, and thus were technically not guilty of her murder. Then the Pontex Maximus would say a final prayer, his hands raised to the heavens, avoiding the gaze of the condemned girl for fear of pollution. Livia would be led down a ladder into the subterranean chamber. Once she was inside, the ladder was pulled up, and the entrance was filled with earth and leveled,
as if nothing had ever been there. Try to picture that final moment, the absolute darkness, the total silence, broken only by her own breathing, the air slowly running out. She would die in darkness, in solitude, and in despair. A terrifying death designed not just to punish an individual, but to purge the guilt of an entire city, to restore the sacred balance between Rome and its gods.
That terrifying death, buried alive, was a possible fate, an ever-present fear. But for the vast majority of Vestal Virgins, for those who fulfilled their duties perfectly, a completely different path awaited them at the end of their 30 years of service, a path that led to a form of freedom that few Roman women could ever dream of. After 30 years, at the age of around 40, a Vestal like Livia was permitted to retire. Her ceremony of release, unlike her capture, was a joyous and honorable event. She was formally freed from her vows. She received a very generous pension from the state, enough to live in wealth and comfort for the rest of her life. And, most importantly, she was now allowed to marry. Let us pause to reflect on this. A 40-year-old woman, wealthy, independent, with immense social prestige, was now available for marriage. She became one of the most desirable catches in the aristocratic marriage market of Rome. Many widowed senators or ambitious politicians would seek to marry a former Vestal. Such a marriage brought not only a large dowry, but also a connection to the sacred, a special respect in the eyes of the public. But surprisingly, and what is most fascinating from a philosophical standpoint, is that many chose not to. A great number of former Vestals chose to remain single for the rest of their lives.
Why would a woman, after sacrificing her youth to a vow of celibacy, refuse the chance to have a family, a normal life? The answer, perhaps, lies in the very nature of the freedom they already possessed. For 30 years, Livia had lived a life that belonged to no man. She was her own mistress. She managed her own property. She made her own decisions. Now, at the age of 40, to marry under Roman law would mean to once again be placed under the authority of a man, her husband. From being a woman respected by all of Rome, she would become a matrona, a wife, whose primary role was to manage a household and produce children. For many, this must have felt like a demotion. They were accustomed to their independence. They did not wish to surrender it.
It is also possible that after 30 years of living in a world of quiet contemplation, of sacred rituals, and of an all-female community, the atrium vesta, their gilded cage, had also become their safe haven. To return to the world, with all its demands and pressures, may have been a frightening prospect. The Stoic philosophy teaches us that true freedom is not found in the ability to do whatever one wants, but in the perfect fulfillment of one's duty, in living in accordance with nature and reason. By that definition, a Vestal Virgin who dedicated her entire life to preserving the well-being of Rome had perhaps achieved a greater form of inner freedom than even an emperor who was a slave to his own passions and fears. Her sacrifice was not a loss, but a fulfillment. The flame in the temple of Vesta, it is much like the flame of reason that a philosopher must guard within his own soul. It requires constant vigilance, absolute devotion, and a willingness to sacrifice. It is a burden and also a glory. These women, in their silence, performed one of the most philosophical of tasks, maintaining order and meaning in a chaotic world. Now, let these thoughts settle. Let the image of the sacred flame, warm and ceaseless, warm your mind. There are no more complex rituals, no more heavy vows, no more fear of terrible punishments. Only the stillness and the pure light of the fire remain. Let it guide you into a peaceful sleep, a rest that even the strongest women of Rome deserved. Let your mind be free. Sleep well.